Hello, Matt.
Hey Graham, nice to see you.
Good to see you as ever. Welcome, everyone, to Crazy in Love, a podcast where two therapists talk about relationships. Matt, trauma today. Big T,
Yeah,
little t trauma, big subject. It's everywhere at the moment. We want to talk about trauma, but also particularly talk about how trauma manifests in relationships, right? In terms of attachment styles, in terms of difficulties or positives we see in relationships. But maybe set the scene for us to begin with in terms of why do we want to talk about trauma, and why has it become more prevalent in conversations about relationships?
yeah. It feels like it's everywhere, doesn't it?
Yeah.
At
Certainly in our field, right?
yeah, in our field, I think, and also in like allied fields,
Yeah.
feels like it's very big in education. For
Yes.
example, everything is
Yeah.
trauma informed. I'm sure someone is making a living training teachers to be trauma informed. There was a recent estimate that I think I was sharing with you before we pressed record. 79% of students UEL identifying themselves as having suffered from trauma. You can get into what that definition means, but I think when you've got those high numbers, you know something's going on. The kind of the trauma Bible, The Body Keeps the Score, that book's been on the New York Times bestseller list for more than 300 weeks now. That's that's a really long time. There's a piece in the New Yorker not so long ago talking about how many characters in TV shows, in particular, memoirs and novels as well, but TV shows, who are kind of dealing with or healing from some sort of psychological trauma, that it's often used as a kind of plot device, that we've come to we've come to not just accept that, but almost expect it, that there'd be something lying deeper under someone's motivation for doing things. And in 2022, I think it was, Vox said trauma was the word of the decade.
Word of the decade.
Word of the decade. And I think in that same year, just when I was looking around, something like 5,500 podcasts with the word trauma in their title. So it feels like it's everywhere. And I mean,
1001 now.
we we see we see plenty of it, don't we? And I don't know whether skeptical is the right word, but I think we probably identify ourselves as a bit skeptical. Tell us, explain why. Give your version of that.
So where I'm skeptical is not the importance of trauma and the realistic impact of trauma that we see in our individual and couples work all the time, right? My skepticism comes in when trauma and its treatment becomes so broad in its definition and its terminology that it becomes almost meaningless. So that 79% figure that you suggested earlier, like, it almost becomes meaningless when you're saying 79% of students have suffered something that is that definable as to be potentially useful. It almost becomes pointless at that stage to say that 79% of people struggle with something. So just to kind of take us back a step, obviously trauma and the idea of trauma comes from the world of medicine. It comes from the idea of like a gut trauma or a head trauma, the idea of something impacting you, the symptoms, the result of something. And I think in its origin and its transference to the world of psychology, trauma means, again, the impact of something, right? So most listeners will be familiar with PTSD, the idea that someone has been in a situation, often something like war or physical or sexual violence, that is so overwhelming to their system that it has an impact on them that really negatively impacts their life. That is a meaningful definition and a diagnosis. We can understand it, but also it's so ring-fenced that we can design treatments that work for it. My skepticism at its starting point is that once an idea like trauma becomes so broad, it becomes both meaningless when we talk about it, but it also affects how we design treatments to help people who go through negative things
Yeah.
in their life.
Yeah, very, very good. That bit's clear, and I think I'd share that. You'd go a bit further as well and say that something like the truth of trauma also lies in the other direction, that we're missing resilience, that we're missing
Yeah. So one of
something ordinary about the way we can make our way through those things.
I would say that has two prongs. So one prong is that often trauma is described as something slightly fatalistic. Something has happened to you, it's transformed who you are. You will always be affected by it and you will never get better. And again, kind of, I think that when we talk about things like PTSD, I think that allows us a window to actually counter that fatalistic response and say, actually, we've got some really good evidence-based treatments here that are going to help you and give you some hope for the future. The flip side of it, as you were just talking about as well a moment ago, is resilience. Is that the vast majority of soldiers who go to war and experience potentially traumatic events don't come back with PTSD, don't come back home with PTSD. Similarly, when we think of potentially traumatic experiences like physical violence or sexual violence, they might affect us in the immediate aftermath and for a while, but we don't necessarily develop a diagnostically relevant response like PTSD or some of the other categories that we might, and diagnoses that we might talk about later on. So when it comes to couples as well, when you think about kind of resilience, we've talked in previous episodes about stress and strain and conflict in relationships potentially being helpful. I think there's one lens through which we can see trauma or response to potentially traumatic events being, actually, human beings are designed to be quite resilient in the face of stress and strain and potentially traumatic experiences. And I think in the current contemporary conversations about trauma, I think we've lost some of that focus on resilience.
Couples can get stuck in conversations around trauma and triggers and wounding and all of that stuff. They can focus too much on that and too little on strengths. Is that too crude a summary, or is that about right?
I think that that is generally right. I'm not too hung up on the words couples use when they talk in sessions with me. I'm not going to kind of intervene and try and pick up whether something is genuinely traumatic or not.
Yeah.
It's more whether that thing feels like an obstacle to connection and progress, right? If it signals a fragility that means someone is consistently in a victim mentality and saying to their partner, you can't go to these difficult areas because I'm too fragile, it will trigger me, it will destroy me,
Yeah.
that limits progress for a couple. And I've definitely seen that where someone's real life trauma or potential trauma has almost dominated the discussion between a couple, to the point where you can't really get past it, can't really get through it. I imagine you've seen something similar.
Yeah, I would agree with what you're saying there. The only thing I'd add, I suppose, maybe sometimes I would challenge more generally than you might. We might have a slightly different style in that respect. I probably would challenge on some of that terminology just because it grates on me sometimes when people are being gaslit. And it's like, do you mean you've disagreed? Do you mean you've forgotten the conversation and that we can't be certain who was right? Like, have you really been manipulated here? Is someone really genuinely trying to make you lose your mind? Like that kind of thing. So if they were using it in a casual way, if it was understood between them, then no. But I think sometimes those things, and that we argued about that and you weren't understood, that's, I would want to push back and say, these are ordinary things in relationships, and it's hard to communicate clearly. It's hard to always convey what you mean, and it's hard to get the right words when we're disagreeing about something we both feel strongly. I would sometimes want couples to come back from that and I guess assume best intent rather than I've got a word to label your behavior now.
Yeah, yeah. I was thinking, I guess, more about words like triggered, right?
Yeah,
The traditionally in the literature on psychology would be connected to a, a, some sort of impulse or situation in the real world has quite literally triggered a kind of flashback in someone.
sure. Yeah.
And I don't mind if one partner
Yeah.
saying that behavior triggers me, it hurts me, it
Yeah.
impacts me. I'm not going to call them up on that. Where I would kind of intervene and challenge is around that kind of fragility, is that idea of you can't face certain things. And obviously our role as a couples therapist is partly to identify if there is a genuine traumatic response going on that might require some treatment separately, that is genuinely providing an obstacle to connection within a partnership. More often, though, I think both of us would say we see kind of quote unquote trauma being used almost as a reason to not go to certain places and to avoid certain conversations, and to almost say to someone's partner, you can't hurt me, I'm not going to let you hurt me, as opposed to saying being hurt by each other is kind of inevitable. And actually, as part of the work of couples therapy, you might get hurt by what someone says to you. Being able to absorb that and to respond in a mature way is part of being in a grown-up couple.
Yeah, and the further thought on that is that actually, if we are anti-fragile, if we benefit from knocks and shocks in the way that bones and muscles benefit from stresses and strains, then actually not only can you withstand it, but it's good for you, it's necessary, it's part of the magic, it's part of the mix, it's part of what will make a relationship stronger and stronger and endure over time.
Yes, definitely. Should we talk a little bit about the ways in which trauma does show up in relationships, just for a moment? That there are various different diagnostic categories: CPTSD, borderline personality disorder, PTSD, etc. I don't want us to go too much into the
I agree.
between them, because I don't think it'll be that interesting for people. But I think it does. I think there's clarity in the literature about genuinely traumatic responses to real life events causing difficulties in relationships, right? Difficulties in terms of correlations with certain attachment styles, difficulties in terms of how you trust people, etc., etc. What do you see in your work with couples that makes you think, trauma is real, trauma impacts relationships and the ways in which it does?
Yeah, it's not the word I'd go to, but I think of it as sort of your start in life, really. And I think those starts in life can absolutely be traumatic, and they can just be awful and horrid, and they can be lonely and frightening and all of those things. So I think for some people, trauma just doesn't sit right. What I hear most often with so I guess largely high functioning client base who are doing well in the world materially is that their childhood was ordinary, and then they'll often describe something which is extraordinary and horrible, and something which I think would have been genuinely upsetting and very difficult to deal with. But the reason I wouldn't go to that term myself and don't often hear it is because I don't think people want to. I think a lot of people don't want to think in those terms and wouldn't cast themselves in that way. So although trauma everywhere, there are quite a few people who I think want to talk about their childhood as ordinary and not really happy to have it described as even neglectful, let alone abusive. So some of what I'm doing is drawing that out from people, that maybe your experience of not being heard, understood, prized, listened to, taken seriously when you were upset, or you were benched for sports, or you were struggling with maths, or you fell out with a friendship group. Those are significant if they repeat and they're the kind of bog standard response. That might be the very reason why you don't turn in and take support from people, why you don't open up, why you feel you've got to go it alone. So I suppose I don't know what you'd call that sort of low-key trauma if you were putting
that kind of connects to where I kind of see the whole debate, really. I see the whole kind of debate is somewhat misleading, in the sense that I see all of what you've just described as almost maladaptive strategies to cope with real life events, right?
Yeah.
And you can box that off in whatever way you want to, whether you call that CPTSD, whether you call it borderline personality disorder, whether you create certain criteria that people need to tick off to be ring fenced into a certain box. But fundamentally, these are maladaptive strategies to real life events. And that might be you might intellectualize, you might repress, you might deny, you might project onto other people, whatever it might be. You might use substances, of course, to deal with difficult emotional responses, whatever it might be. That's the bit when I'm talking with a client, I'm thinking, not is this CPTSD or is it PTSD or is it borderline personality? So there's an element of that, of course, that I'm thinking, but broadly, I'm thinking, how has this person developed their personality and their responses in ways that are not emotionally healthy? And that can really manifest in relationships, right? It can really, if you're getting projected onto by someone that just can't deal with their emotions, they're just pushing their anger onto you, or they're criticizing you all the time because they can't deal with their own insecurities, whatever it might be. That's the maladaptive strategy that with a couple, I want to kind of go into and target and try and understand and change.
Yeah, I agree. I think that's exactly the task, isn't it? And sometimes I suppose maybe in danger of repeating ourselves, but I think coming back to the trauma narrative can keep that a bit hidden away, or like it's very, very difficult, or it's going to take a really long time, or you've got to go and see a special kind of therapist who's trauma informed, which always sort of makes me laugh, the idea of kind of doing psychotherapy and not being trauma informed.
Yes, exactly. Yeah.
An oxymoron, isn't it? It makes almost no sense to me. So although I would say I definitely see clients who are at the sharp end of that spectrum, where experiences have been awful and it has really profoundly shaped their character, I would say I see way more people who've just had a set of unhappy things happen, suboptimal things happen, a kind of coldness, or in this family we stand on our own 2 feet, or whatever it might be, that if that message gets repeated again and again and again, it shapes you in a direction. You tend to default towards being needy or clingy or avoidant in those sort of situations. So I don't know how you'd sum that up.
I think we're on the same track in terms of maladaptive strategies, right? Maladaptive responses to difficult situations. So another theme in the conversation in recent years has been adverse childhood experiences, right? Lots of people go through some very difficult childhood experiences, whether it's divorce, whether it's losing a parent, whether it's a parent in prison, whether it's growing up in poverty and high crime neighborhoods. There are strong correlations with life outcomes and strong correlations with psychiatric diagnoses later on in life too, that I don't think can be ignored. But beyond saying bad experiences lead to difficult responses, I'm not sure how enormously helpful that literature is in terms of then kind of going, okay, what does that mean for that person in terms of if they're in a relationship, how do we help them have more effective relationships? Now, again, there's links with attachment styles and ways you can help someone understand their responses and give them tools and techniques to respond. But that's quite an individual response. You're dealing with the individual rather than a kind of broad sense of trauma leads to X, Y, and Z in relationships.
That's a helpful segue. And people will probably have heard of adverse childhood experiences, are sometimes called ACEs, and generally there are taken to be 10, sometimes 12 of them, depending on how you count. But you ran through a few of them, but they're conflated together. So you end up within that sort of batch of things. I think you're saying that this is too broad to be useful. I think I'm trying to make the same point, just with drawing out an example. So something like parental separation is in there as an adverse childhood experience. And I think for a lot of people, that is an adverse experience. They didn't enjoy it. It wasn't handled well. But sexual abuse is also in there. And without weighing those things, without making commentary on which is more important than another, I think for most people, they would seem to be somewhat different levels of difficulty, challenge, or adversity in those two examples. So it's so broad. I think it's why the young people at UEL answer that survey question in the way that they do, because those traumatic or adverse experiences are defined very broadly. That we're not talking about 79% of the students there almost certainly haven't experienced sexual abuse, for example.
Yes, and going back a step, I don't imagine 79% of them have experienced something that has the outcomes in terms of their psychological and physical makeup that we would describe as traumatic, right? They're potentially, all of those adverse childhood experiences are potentially traumatic. The vast majority of people will go through those experiences, certainly if they only have a few of them, without a traumatic response, without something that deeply affects how they act in the world and relate to other people. They might have minor problems that surface in relationships because of it, but possibly not ones that need therapy to correct necessarily.
that's the other bit, isn't it? That you can be buffered from the worst effects of those things, and I think that's where some of my interest would be. It might not be for this podcast, but you can have those experiences and still live well, and you can have those experiences and they can end up massively affecting your life. So even growing up in something like a high crime neighborhood, or the examples you were giving in poverty, like that is a different experience with a parent who is loving you and has their arm around your shoulder and steps you through those challenges and other challenges in life. And that's very different if that parent is entirely absent or hooked on drugs or just isn't in good enough shape to do any of the basic parenting, looking after, protecting, providing, guiding, coaching kind of roles.
Definitely, there's a number of factors that play into resilience in the face of potentially traumatic experiences. One of which, as you say, is kind of community, isn't it? Is role models around you, people that make you feel cared for and supported, even if times are tough.
Yeah.
There's also, if we're honest, a genetic element, isn't there? There's a temperament element that some people are born with. Some people are more genetically predisposed to be a bit more vulnerable to traumatic experiences that I think often gets ignored in the literature as well.
Yeah, there's some very popular kind of therapists, quasi-therapists, talking about everything having its root in trauma or adverse childhood experiences, and that it's at the root of something like ADHD, which I mean, we haven't rehearsed these lines, but I'm guessing you think is kind of nonsense. I mean, I'd speak.
I think it's clearly nonsense. I think it's clearly nonsense that I think particularly when you're going into the realms of neurodiversity, I think it's clearly nonsense. I imagine that there are impacts of traumatic experiences that lead to symptoms that look like and manifest in similar ways to some of the symptoms and ways of thinking and ways of being in the world that someone who has a diagnosis of ADHD carries. I think Gabor Maté, for example, when he expands trauma to define everything, again we're back in the realms of it explains everything, therefore it explains nothing in my view.
Yeah, and not terribly interesting point, but it sits well outside the scientific consensus, and it probably is worth saying that, in
we should go even further than that, right? A lot of the understandable mind-body split in psychology suggests that trauma is stored in the body. So you mentioned Bessel van der Kolk's book, The Body Keeps the Score, is based on that idea that trauma is somehow stored in the body in this pseudo-scientific way. Like, of course, it has physical impacts, traumatic events in differing ways. So you might raise your stress levels, your default kind of stress level, the cortisol in your system, et cetera, et cetera. That mind-body split fallacy means that someone like Bessel van der Kolk says that you should treat traumatic responses through the body rather than a range of interventions that might involve kind of some physical intervention like yoga, etc. It might involve some skills-based stuff that you do on dealing with your emotions. It might mean some traditional CBT interventions of talking about the trauma and slow, gradual exposure, like a range of tools in your toolbox. But this slightly pseudo-scientific mind-body split of we just need to treat trauma through the body, I think, is another way that we get sidetracked.
Yeah, anything that sort of skips a kind of cognitive restructuring, I don't really buy. You could add on some things. I wouldn't claim a deep expertise on all of those treatments, but anything which suggests you can sidestep that kind of process of, I suppose, exposure, as it would be described in cognitive behavioral tradition, seems to me to be, hokum, really.
Yeah, it felt like you were going to go somewhere else when you were just talking about ADHD, Gabor Maté, anything.
No, I guess on that, just that it lies well outside the scientific consensus, and it's probably worth saying that. So, I mean, we're not in some ways, within therapy land, maybe we're staking out controversial territory, because I think a lot of therapists really like that literature. They like the two people who you've just mentioned. They are very popular in therapy land, and they're popular on socials, and they're popular generally. They're good. Particularly Gabor Maté is a good storyteller, isn't he? He's a very convincing guest on a podcast, and he is everywhere. But I was reading an interview recently with Bessel van der Kolk, and he was saying, like, it's really minority stuff in academia. Like, nobody does buy this. I interviewed somebody called Felicity. I can't get her name right.
Melissa?
Yes. Thank
Mm.
you. A couple of years back now, for something I was writing, and she's a prominent voice in this area. She was also on the staff at the Maudsley, and she said for most mainstream psychiatrists, the trauma story is a kind of fairy tale. And I suppose we're bringing some of that too, that in therapy land, on socials, this is a really big deal, and it's like trauma everywhere. And it probably is worth telling people. I want to tell some of my clients, this is not necessarily where the science is. This is not necessarily where the evidence is. This isn't terribly well researched right now, and it's being, lots of those treatments are being overused. They're prescribed in very specific circumstances, often only when you request them through the NHS. The limits on their use, for example, through NICE guidelines, it's very limited, their use. Whereas I think lots of therapists are providing those sorts of treatments for a whole host of things.
Good. Good. Let's bring it back to couples and relationships before we finish. What advice would you have for someone in a relationship with someone who is talking about trauma, is wanting them to understand their traumatic responses to real life impacts?
Yeah. I mean, I sort of want both things. I want people to take that really seriously, that those early childhood experiences, my view of the world is that they impact and shape us, but that they're not the final word, right? That there's lots that's happened since childhood. Some of that will be a repetition of some things in childhood, and other things won't, right? That there are some people now who can be trusted. So if you had a hard time in childhood, reaching out, leaning on people, telling them about your feelings before they become very angry and they peak and they explode out of you, you can do something differently now. So there's a kind of, for me, there's a bit of both in that. There's a taking it seriously and wanting to tell people, wanting to encourage people not to think of that as the final word, to take things seriously, because some people don't. They've got a good life, they've got a good home, they've got a nice car, they've got a well-paying job, and therefore, that sort of childhood unhappiness or being shaped in that way maybe doesn't make so much sense to them. But when I see them, it makes a lot of sense to me. For those people, I'd really want them to be in touch with that a little bit more, how they were shaped, what their defaults look like.
That's helpful, because I guess if the tone of this conversation has been more one that's skeptical about the use of some of the trauma interventions and the terminology around trauma and the language and cultural focus, you've just brought us back to the core truth, which is real life experiences, particularly in early life, matter. They shape your personality to a large degree. They shape those maladaptive responses that show up in relationships. And an awful lot of people haven't confronted that, talked about that, had that validated, certainly haven't had it validated by a loving partner in a romantic relationship. And I think that coming to couples therapy, a lot of our role early on is to validate both people's experiences, right? And try and get the other person to show appreciation for those experiences as well, before you then move into, okay, how do we shift this? How do we change that? And it's important that I think we end on that note of, this is crucially important. We might not call it trauma in the way that a lot of people in our field would, but to some degree the semantics don't matter. The semantics matter if they act as a barrier and a block to progress for an individual and for a couple. But broadly, those early experiences matter in terms of how you act in relationships.
Yeah, there's validating that, isn't there, and drawing that out a bit. I think you and I would see that as our task, and that if you've got a good income and a good job and whatever else, that doesn't
protect you from it.
It doesn't protect you from it, no. So a lot of the people I see are genuinely doing well in the world. Some of them are high net worth individuals, and there isn't a great deal of sympathy for that group of people, but they are often experiencing the same sorts of traumatic or painful experiences growing up as others are. They're just doing so with sometimes with a level of privilege, and sometimes in a bigger home. And I wouldn't say that those environmental factors are nothing, and that privilege and wealth and whatever else doesn't buffer you, but those experiences, they look very similar.
Yes, I think in some ways sometimes the privilege can exacerbate the existing problems. It can make it easier for you to deny. It can make it easier for you to move into some problematic responses like substance abuse. You've got more money, you can more easily afford Coke at the weekend. You can more easily afford whatever kind of substance of choice you want, and you can probably more easily hide it from other people.
Yeah, it's a bit like maybe you were trying to wrap us up, but it made me think of Prince Harry and
Yes. Yeah.
just how easy it is to mock him as a figure of farness and overprivileged kind of man child who moans about stuff that happens to him. And I think there's a temptation to go there, isn't there? Even in the Guardian, they reviewed his autobiography with the headline "Dry Your Eyes, Mate." But it's a sad story as well. And I think for him, like the privilege and the princely status sort of get in the way of the fact that like that's a devastating start in life to lose a parent at the age he did.
100%. 100%. And I think that easy dismissal of someone else's pain, I think does connect to relationships. That I think we're too quick to just go, yeah, but that was 20 years ago. Like, you're in a relationship with me right now. You need to stop acting like that. And it's easier said than done. And it certainly doesn't come from that tough love place of more toughness than love. Like, you've got to wrap it up with some love to begin with and show that you understand and you care about that before you can ask your partner to really push through and to try and change some of those responses.
Yeah, that's a nice place to sign off.
Good to see you as ever.
Same.
Contact us at crazyinlovepodcast UK@gmail.com, and we'll see you soon.